You won't believe what happened when a Karen from the HOA decided to take matters in her own hands, destroying my property and pushing me to the edge. After months of harassment, I finally had enough. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you amazing stories like this one. For months, a woman from the local HOA, whom I quickly started calling Karen for her entitled and demanding behavior, has been riding her ATV through my private property every single day. I had only recently moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood, hoping to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. My house, tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac, seemed like the perfect sanctuary. It was peaceful with wide open spaces and a perfect view of the mountains in the distance. But little did I know, this quiet haven was about to be disrupted by someone who seemed to believe the rules didn't apply to her. The first time I noticed the woman on her ATV, it was early on a Saturday morning. I was just finishing my coffee, standing by the kitchen window, when I saw a small cloud of dust rolling up my driveway. At first, I thought it was some sort of construction equipment or a passing vehicle. But then, as the figure came into clearer view, I recognized the woman from the neighborhood HOA. She was riding a large, red ATV, her sunglasses perched on top of her head, wearing a leather jacket that seemed far too glamorous for such a rugged machine. She wasn't just passing by my house. She was driving across my front yard, cutting through my grass with reckless abandon. Her ATV churned the earth beneath it, leaving deep tire tracks across my freshly manicured lawn. As she rode past my porch, I could hear the engine's roar and the sound of her muffled laughter. It wasn't until I saw her do this again the next day, then the day after, that I realized this was no accident. At first, I didn't know what to do. It seemed like a minor issue. After all, it was just a bit of dirt and noise. But it didn't take long for the situation to escalate. Every day, like clockwork, she would ride by at the same time, creating a commotion that was impossible to ignore. The noise, the dust, and the damage to my property were starting to wear on my nerves. But it wasn't just the noise that irritated me. It was the principle of it. The fact that she felt entitled to cross my land without permission. So, I decided to confront her. One afternoon, as she zipped past once more, I went outside and flagged her down. Her ATV came to a screeching halt, and she looked at me, puzzled. "Hey, could you please stop riding through my property?" I asked politely, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "This is private land, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't drive through here." She immediately rolled her eyes, clearly irritated. "This is a public trail, you know," she shot back, revving her engine as if to make her point louder. "You can't just put up a fence or something to stop me. This is the route I've always taken. I'm not hurting anyone." I was taken aback by her audacity. "This is my property," I replied, "and I'm asking you to respect it. There's no public trail here. I've already put up no trespassing signs." Her response was swift and dismissive. "You're being dramatic over a little dirt," she said with a huff. "People have been using this path for years. I'm not going to stop just because you moved in. Get over it." With that, she gunned the engine and sped off, leaving a trail of dust in her wake. I stood there, stunned but determined. I knew I couldn't let this continue. The next few days were more of the same. Every morning and every evening, the roar of her ATV became a constant presence in my life. She would speed across my yard, leaving tracks behind, kicking up dust that found its way into my windows, my garden, and even my lungs. I wasn't just annoyed anymore. I was furious. It wasn't just the inconvenience. It was the sheer disrespect. This woman had no regard for the rules, no regard for my boundaries, and no intention of listening to anyone who dared to stand up to her. Finally, I decided it was time to take more drastic action. I went to the local hardware store and bought a heavy-duty chain and lock. I used it to set up a barrier at the end of the path that she was using to cross my yard. It wasn't a huge blockade, just enough to make it clear that she couldn't continue to ride through. I spent hours setting it up, making sure it was visible and sturdy. I even put up additional signs that said, "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." The very next day, I heard the familiar sound of her ATV. I could see her coming from my window, her red vehicle bouncing across the uneven terrain. My heart raced as I watched her approach the barrier I'd set up. I was standing on my porch, waiting for her to hit it. And sure enough, she did. There was a loud thud followed by a shriek of frustration as she slammed into the chain. The ATV jerked to a stop, and she jumped off, her face flushed with anger. She stormed up to my house, yelling something I couldn't quite make out. I walked down the porch steps and approached her. "I told you," I said, my voice calm but firm. "This is private property. You have no right to be here." She glared at me, shaking her head. "What kind of person puts a chain up like this? You're ruining everything for the rest of us. You're such a selfish little man." She jabbed her finger in my direction as if I were the one who had caused the issue. I wasn't about to back down, but I knew it was time to be reasonable. "You're trespassing. I've asked you to stop, but you refuse to listen. I'm within my rights to block off the path." At that, she whipped out her phone and dialed 911. "I'm calling the cops," she said, her voice rising with every word. "He set up a dangerous obstacle, and I can't get through. He's trying to trap me on my route." When the police arrived, the situation became even more ridiculous. I calmly explained the situation, showing them the no trespassing signs and my property deed. The officer gave her a stern look and then turned to me. "You're in the right here," he said. "She has no claim to this land, and she's been warned. You're allowed to set up barriers on your property." Karen, as expected, wasn't happy with this conclusion. She started to yell even louder, screaming about how I was ruining the neighborhood's traditions. "I've been riding this trail for years," she shouted. "You can't just come in here and mess things up. You're the one causing all the trouble." The officer ignored her rants and warned her not to return. She was furious, but she begrudgingly left, storming off in the direction of her ATV. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of her tantrums. The next few weeks would be filled with even more outbursts and confrontations, each more outrageous than the last. But one thing was clear: I had drawn a line in the sand, and Karen was about to find out just how far I was willing to go to protect my property. After the police left, I thought the problem was over. Surely, after being told off by an officer, Karen would have realized that her behavior wasn't just annoying, it was illegal. I expected her to back off, maybe apologize, or at least give up on riding her ATV through my property. But, to my utter shock, Karen wasn't done. She seemed to believe that as long as she kept pushing, she could intimidate me into letting her do whatever she wanted. It didn't take long for me to realize that Karen wasn't just going to back down. She was about to escalate things. The very next day, I woke up to find my mailbox smashed to pieces. It was as if someone had deliberately driven over it. There was no note, no explanation, just the shattered remains of what had been a perfectly functional mailbox the day before. I stood in front of the wreckage, my stomach sinking. I could already tell this wasn't a coincidence. Karen had been furious after the officer left, and now it seemed like she was taking her frustration out on me in any way she could. It wasn't the first time she had crossed a line, but this felt personal. My mailbox was just the beginning. I filed a report with the local authorities, but I wasn't optimistic. Without direct evidence linking Karen to the vandalism, it seemed like a long shot. The officer who took the report was kind enough, but made it clear there wasn't much they could do without proof. But deep down I knew she was behind it. Over the next few days, things only got worse. A few days later, I found that my garden had been trampled. The lush flower beds, which I'd worked hard to cultivate, had been flattened, the delicate plants uprooted, and the soil disturbed. It was as if someone had gone out of their way to destroy something I cared about. I wasn't sure if Karen had done this, but I couldn't help but suspect her. She was the only one who had consistently been causing trouble in my life. The timing was too coincidental, and I wasn't about to ignore it. I knew I needed to take action, something more proactive than just waiting for another incident. I couldn't allow Karen to think she could destroy my property and get away with it. I decided to install security cameras. I didn't know if they would catch anything, but I figured it was worth a shot. I spent a day setting up the cameras around my yard, ensuring they covered every angle. The idea of catching Karen in the act of vandalizing my property filled me with a sense of relief. At least this time, I would have proof. A few days after installing the cameras, I woke up to an alert from my security system. My phone buzzed, and I quickly checked the footage. Sure enough, it was Karen. In the dead of night, she snuck onto my property, carrying a flashlight. She was moving toward my irrigation system. As I watched in disbelief, she crouched down and started tampering with the valves, twisting them and making sure they leaked water all over my garden. The footage was clear. Karen had intentionally sabotaged my irrigation system, and I had it all on tape. This was it. I had the proof I needed. I immediately called the police and showed them the footage. The officer who responded was visibly shocked when he saw what Karen had done. "This is more than just a little trespassing," he said, his tone serious. "This is deliberate vandalism. We'll be filing a report." But before any real investigation could take place, Karen made her next move. It wasn't enough for her to simply destroy my property from the shadows. She was now out in the open, trying to assert her dominance in front of me. One afternoon, I was in my living room when I looked outside and saw her SUV parked right in front of my driveway, blocking it completely. I walked out to confront her, my frustration boiling over. "What are you doing here?" I demanded. Karen stood with her arms crossed, an arrogant smile on her face. "You think you can stop me?" she sneered. "I'm part of the HOA. I can do whatever I want. You don't own this neighborhood. I'm not going anywhere." Her words stung. The idea that she thought her position in the HOA gave her the right to do whatever she pleased on my property was infuriating. I'd had enough. "You're blocking my driveway. Move your car now," I said, my voice firm. Her eyes narrowed as she leaned in, her voice dripping with disdain. "I'll move it when I'm ready. You can't tell me what to do." She sounded like she had all the time in the world to push my buttons. But I wasn't backing down. "I'm calling a tow truck," I said, already reaching for my phone. I called a towing company and told them to send a truck to remove Karen's SUV. The dispatcher told me it would take about an hour for the tow truck to arrive. As I sat down on my porch, waiting for the tow, Karen's frustration grew. She paced back and forth, muttering under her breath. I could tell she was on the edge. Then, as if to escalate things further, she turned to face me and yelled, "You think you've won? You think you can control me? You're nothing. You don't belong here, and I'll make sure you regret this." Her voice was shrill, and her face was red with anger. She was so consumed by her fury that she didn't even seem to care that she was making a scene. "You're pathetic," she yelled. "Try to ruin my life just because you don't like a little dirt on your lawn. You'll regret this, I promise you." It was clear that Karen wasn't backing down, and it was becoming obvious that her need for control was turning into something more dangerous. She wasn't just trying to intimidate me anymore. She was escalating into full-blown aggression. Finally, the tow truck arrived. The driver, a burly man with a no-nonsense attitude, quickly got to work. Karen tried to block him from hooking up her car, but it was clear the driver wasn't intimidated by her antics. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," he said in a calm voice, sidestepping her. She continued to scream at him, but he didn't even flinch. Within minutes, Karen's car was hitched to the tow truck, and the driver began to pull away. I could hear Karen in the distance, still yelling, "You'll regret this. You haven't seen the last of me." She was practically shaking with rage, but there was nothing she could do. Her car was gone, and all she had left were her empty threats. As the tow truck drove off, I finally allowed myself to take a deep breath. But this was far from over. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't going to stop until she had destroyed my peace of mind completely. I knew this wasn't the end. Things were about to get even more out of control before I could put a stop to her. After the tow truck incident, I thought I had made my point clear to Karen. Surely, she would get the message that I wasn't going to tolerate her bullying and petty retaliation. But I was wrong. Karen was more than just a difficult neighbor. She was relentless, a force of nature that refused to acknowledge anyone's boundaries, even when those boundaries were firmly rooted in the law. The very next morning, as if nothing had happened, I woke up to find yet another surprise. This time, it wasn't a vandalized mailbox or a trampled garden. It was something far worse. The front door of my house had been spray-painted with bold, angry letters. "Get out" was emblazoned across the wooden surface in bright red paint, covering the entire door. I stood there for a moment, staring at the words, disbelief settling in as my mind raced. How could she do this? How far was Karen willing to go to assert her control over my life? My heart sank. I had never expected things to escalate this far. The mailbox and garden had been minor annoyances, things I could repair. But this was different. This was personal. She had crossed a line. I immediately called the police and filed another report. The officer who arrived looked equally appalled at the state of my door. "This is a criminal act of vandalism," he said, taking pictures of the damage. "We'll take a statement and investigate this further. But I'm warning you, if you feel threatened, we'll have to escalate this." I nodded, my thoughts running in overdrive. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to stop anytime soon. But what could I do? I had already done everything within my power to stop her. Filed reports, spoken to authorities, put up barriers. And yet, she kept coming back, pushing further and further. I was beginning to feel cornered in my own home. A few days later, after the paint was cleaned off and my door was repainted, I decided to take a more direct approach. I knew Karen well enough by now to understand that she only respected power. She only responded to forceful actions. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands in a way that I hoped would get her attention once and for all. I started gathering legal documents, preparing to file a restraining order against her. The paperwork was tedious, but I was determined. I knew it would be a lengthy process, but it was the only way to ensure that Karen's constant harassment would finally be brought to a halt. I spent days filling out forms, collecting evidence of her trespassing, vandalism, and threats. It wasn't just the paint on my door that bothered me. It was the sense of invasion, the knowledge that I had no privacy in my own home. I was living under siege, and it had gone on long enough. Just as I was finalizing the restraining order paperwork, I received a call from the HOA. It was the first time they had reached out to me since the incident with Karen. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, but seemed almost apologetic. "We've received several complaints from Karen," the woman said. "She's claiming that you're harassing her and making her feel unsafe in the neighborhood. We understand you've had some disputes, but we think it's time you and Karen have a conversation to resolve this." I almost laughed. A conversation? After everything she's done? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. I don't think a conversation is going to solve anything. I've been more than patient, but she's gone too far. She's vandalized my property, trespassed on my land, and threatened me. I've tried everything to resolve this peacefully, and she's ignored every boundary I've set. The HOA representative seemed to hesitate before continuing. "I understand that, but we don't want this situation to escalate any further. It's in everyone's best interest to find a peaceful solution. We suggest you meet with her, and we'll mediate the conversation." At that moment, I felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. The HOA, the very organization that was supposed to protect the neighborhood and ensure people follow the rules, was siding with Karen. They were suggesting that I meet with the woman who had made my life a living nightmare. I didn't want to be part of some ridiculous mediation where Karen could continue to twist the narrative to make herself out to be the victim. But I also knew I couldn't avoid the HOA forever. They had a lot of influence in the neighborhood, and if they continued to side with Karen, things would only get worse. Reluctantly, I agreed to meet with Karen. The meeting was set for the following afternoon, and the HOA promised to have a representative present to mediate. I was nervous but determined. I wasn't going to let Karen continue to dictate the terms of this dispute. I was going to make my stance clear, and I wasn't going to back down. When I arrived at the designated meeting location, I saw Karen sitting in the small conference room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked every bit the entitled, angry woman I had come to know over the past few months. The HOA representative, a mild-mannered woman named Lisa, greeted me and led me to the table where Karen was already seated. "Let's keep this calm and respectful," Lisa said, trying to set the tone. But I could see from Karen's tight-lipped expression that she was already preparing for a confrontation. Karen wasted no time in launching into her version of the story. "I don't know why he's making such a big deal about everything," she began, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I've lived here for years, and I've always used that path. He's the one who's being unreasonable. He's trying to ruin the neighborhood, and now he's trying to make me look bad." I had to hold myself back from interrupting her. Karen was twisting the narrative, playing the role of the poor victim, just like she always did. But this time, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. "I've asked you multiple times to stay off my property," I said, my voice steady. "You've trespassed, you've damaged my property, and you've made my life miserable. I've done nothing to provoke you. This is not about the neighborhood. This is about you disrespecting my boundaries and my rights." Karen's face turned red with fury. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm done with this," she shouted. "You're just trying to make me look crazy. You're the one who's ruining everything. I'll have you kicked out of here if it's the last thing I do." Lisa quickly stood up, trying to calm the situation, but Karen was beyond reason. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. I stood there, trying to process what had just happened. It was clear that Karen wasn't interested in resolving anything. She wasn't interested in peace. She only cared about getting her way, no matter the cost. But this time, I wasn't going to let her win. The very next day, I filed for the restraining order. It wasn't an easy decision. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but after everything Karen had done, it was the only way to ensure my safety and sanity. A few weeks later, I received confirmation that the restraining order had been granted. Karen was legally prohibited from coming anywhere near me, my property, or my home. The victory was sweet, but it was bittersweet as well. It shouldn't have had to come to this. I shouldn't have had to endure months of harassment, threats, and vandalism just to protect my home. But at least, in the end, I had taken a stand. Karen eventually moved out of the neighborhood, likely due to the mounting legal pressure. The HOA, now fully aware of her behavior, distanced themselves from her completely. But the damage had already been done. My peaceful life was forever interrupted by her selfishness, and I would never forget how far she had gone to make my life a living nightmare. Still, I had won, and in the end, that was all that mattered.